Toronto spends endless billions on urban development every year, but will never once try to sell you on its problems. They sell an idea: diversity, opportunity, progress. But some would say it's a distraction from the disturbing truth. There are a lot of serious accusations against the city that it's caused unaffordability, displacement, environmental strain, and much, much worse. So buckle up, we're going on a journey through Toronto's incredible history, spanning 3 different centuries. We'll be examining how Toronto really became one of the most recognised cities ever, and at what cost. Because one thing is for sure, you don't build a global metropolis by telling people the truth. Toronto gives you that refreshing new feeling. There's nothing like a vibrant, bustling Toronto. Back in the early days, there was a bit of a clash against the natural landscape, and people started shaping the land instead. And a bunch of ambitious settlers pounced on this opportunity and started creating outposts and settlements that they claimed had a wide variety of strategic benefits. The truth was that they were mostly ambitious, often disruptive, concoctions of various different interests. But with no clear understanding of the long-term impact, they could claim whatever benefits they wanted, so development was booming. One popular strategic location was called Toronto, which contained a mix of natural resources and strategic positioning that supposedly offered almost any advantage whatsoever, as long as you developed it relentlessly. And one group who absolutely loved this area was the British, who had been severely impacted by the American Revolutionary War. The British had actually thought they were going to lose their influence in the region and desperately sought new territories for their loyalists. But the British somehow persevered. However, they did develop a serious need for new settlements, which is why when they discovered the Toronto area, they became hooked on the land. They thought it was helping them overcome their colonial losses, and of course, after settling it, they really did feel better. But that's not because it was inherently superior, it's because it contained vast resources and strategic access. But since the British loved the land and they were keen on expansion, they decided to create their own version, and in 1793 they launched York, which was basically a reimagining of the Indigenous lands with a couple more colonial intentions added. And yet, this nascent settlement would soon become Toronto. Now, to be fair to the early settlers, they weren't some snake oil salesmen trying to deliberately exploit the land. They really believed in its potential. However, their timing was challenging. Just a few decades later, the War of 1812 hits, with American forces attacking the fledgling town. York had to endure significant damage and occupation, but this left the town with a bitter taste, so they rebuilt with a huge amount of resilience to counteract that. Now that the immediate threat was removed, York could continue growing, but they needed a new name. Luckily, the growing population came up with a catchy-sounding suggestion: Toronto. Now, the city would later claim that the name doesn't mean anything, and it's just a nice-sounding historical reference. Of course, this isn't true. The name was a reference to the Indigenous origins, the Mohawk word Toronto, meaning where there are trees standing in the water. To this day, some narratives deny their Indigenous roots, despite the fact it's extremely well documented it contained the original meaning, which connects to the land. Eventually, by the 19th century, they would find a way to establish a formal city structure once it became clear that a loose settlement wasn't quite the organised entity they'd first thought. But back in the early 1800s, nobody was worried about the Indigenous meaning in the name, so now that the colonial past had been established, Toronto could continue being built. The only problem is, not many people were moving to it. Early leaders were still trying to sell people on the strategic aspect of the location. Early ads for Toronto described it as a promising new capital that offered opportunities and growth. But growth was slow because there were countless other settlements offering the same thing, so Toronto didn't really stand out. Meanwhile, the early city was becoming increasingly challenged. Its infrastructure was worse, and its population growing slowly. And by 1834, York was incorporated as Toronto. The irony is, they had absolutely no idea that their city would soon become one of the most well-known urban centres on the entire planet. Right before its incorporation, the city was a small, ambitious settlement. Leaders then began attracting any outstanding immigrants and businesses so they could have the city fully under their control. Later investigations would find that early leaders may not have really considered the long-term impact, as some of the decisions contained short-sighted planning. We may never know exactly what happened because early records of urban development were often fragmented, most likely to cover their tracks. But all that was irrelevant, because by the late 19th century, Toronto was fully in charge of its own destiny. But remember, the city wasn't actually that popular at first. So leaders started filling the region with Toronto-branded banners, billboards and placards. They even painted the logo on streetcars and basically plastered the Toronto logo on anything they could. So people started seeing the city everywhere they went. But one of Toronto's first strokes of urban genius was to contact every major business in the area, get a list of their top employees, and send them an invitation to relocate to Toronto. The logic was that by giving people a free trial, they'd become residents for life, especially since the city offered several appealing amenities. However, it soon became clear that advertising Toronto as just a strategic location was the wrong strategy. Rather than just market to people who were seeking land, they could market it to everyone by simply positioning it as a diverse, welcoming city that anyone could enjoy. This had the added benefit of disassociating Toronto from its purely colonial past, which would soon face a lot of scrutiny once people realised that most of their early claims were incomplete. Toronto's mass marketing strategy was a huge hit as the population started to grow rapidly. Leaders reinvested more and more money into infrastructure, and even started attracting major corporations and cultural institutions to endorse the city. Is that Toronto? Yes, sir. So much of Toronto's success has been about creating such a positive, wholesome image in people's minds of what the city represents. And what better way to do that than attract popular businesses and cultural events to recommend the city? They even started heavily featuring its diversity in their ads, always showcasing its multiculturalism to make the connection in people's minds between Toronto and the joy of urban living. Of course, none of this marketing may sound particularly special, but at the time, it was groundbreaking. Toronto pioneered many urban development strategies that soon became commonplace. For example, economic incentives may be a development cliché these days, but very few mainstream cities exploited this as much as Toronto did, with its use of tax breaks and grants for attractive businesses, who always had an eye on growth. Toronto even created a statistical department to analyse traffic and movement in the city, so they could determine the most effective places to put their developments. And as new technology was introduced from subways to skyscrapers, Toronto was always ready to throw money into development on these new mediums to ensure everyone everywhere knew about its progress. Initially, though, Toronto was mostly a collection of distinct neighbourhoods. This allowed the city to save huge amounts of money because they simply had to manage local services, and then it would be integrated by whoever was living there. So the administrative and distribution costs for Toronto were much lower. But then one day, two politicians named Benjamin and Joseph came to City Council with an idea: let's amalgamate it. Council thought this was a really dumb idea. Amalgamation was very expensive and complicated, but Benjamin and Joseph said they would take on all the cost and risk themselves. So Council agreed and signed a contract granting them full amalgamation rights for Toronto for just a nominal fee. Council figured they had nothing to lose in the unlikely scenario that this amalgamation idea actually went well. It simply meant they would govern a much larger city. Of course, as we now know, amalgamated Toronto was an unimaginably huge success. Residents loved the unified Toronto, so at first, this was great for Council. It meant the new city was attracting loads and loads of new residents, and this was a great revenue stream for the city. But there was one very major problem. Because Council hadn't believed amalgamation would work, they'd put almost no thought into the contract they signed. So there was no clear framework set on the deal, and no mention about changing the governance structure if the cost to manage the expanded city increased. What this meant is that City Council had given the amalgamated entities a never-ending mandate to operate with limited oversight, 0919, at the same low administrative cost, no matter how much the cost of urban services went up. This would lead to multiple debates between Toronto and its former municipalities over the next few decades. The City of Toronto would end up paying countless millions of dollars to integrate some of the services that Council had overlooked. But back in the early 2000s, this wasn't a worry for Council, because sales of Toronto were higher than ever, and growing every year. Of course, this wasn't really because of the inherent perfection of the city. There were countless very similar cities out there. I remember Toronto was a reimagining of another settlement anyway. The reason for the rapid growth was marketing. Every single year, Toronto spent more and more money on advertising, and every single year, sales of Toronto grew. However, arguably Toronto's biggest challenges of all would come from a pretty surprising source. Once the global financial crisis broke out, it was announced budgets would be tightened. However, Toronto made the absurd claim that they should be exempt from the budget tightening because Toronto was an essential economic engine, and even more absurdly, the government agreed. This was largely because Toronto spent huge amounts of money on lobbying the government. The city funded countless studies to try and convince the government of Toronto's benefits, and they claimed that Toronto would keep up morale and provide an economic boost for the nation. Eventually, the Canadian government agreed to appoint a Toronto executive onto the Economic Board, who then gave Toronto an exemption from budget tightening, whilst every other city had to reduce the quantities of spending they used during the crisis. And Toronto didn't stop there. The city's mayor publicly promised, "We will see that every resident gets a chance to thrive in Toronto, wherever they are and whatever it costs our city." Now, by maintaining its growth, Toronto would incur significant costs on each new development. And yet, this decision was absolutely genius. Firstly, in the eyes of the public and especially new residents, it created a strong connection between Toronto and economic prosperity, and helped Toronto gain huge public support and goodwill in the minds of millions of Canadians. Toronto and opportunity became connected. Toronto seized upon this opportunity to run new economic ads showing diverse residents thriving in the city, but not just that. Behind the scenes, Toronto had made a deal with the government about getting money to help them set up urban development projects overseas. They claimed it would spread Canadian influence and boost economic morale. But what it really meant is the tax payout was helping to fund Toronto's international expansion. During this period, numerous Toronto-led urban initiatives were set up around the world on different continents, mostly funded by the government. In fact, the urban planners who implemented Toronto's strategies during this time were deemed just as vital as the people who were fixing national economies. And because Toronto's model was now accessible to cities wherever they were in the world, they started sharing the urban planning with the locals, helping Toronto's influence into even more new countries. The cities were so thankful for Toronto sending them a taste of urban innovation during the hell of economic downturns that they became the city's biggest advocates. The Canadian government basically became a Toronto sales force, introducing new urban models wherever they went. So whilst the crisis had a devastating impact on most companies and people, Toronto was expanding faster than ever all over the globe. As of today, there are countless cities in the world that emulate Toronto's model, and the deals Toronto made during the crisis were largely responsible for Toronto's rapid global expansion across the planet. Now, there's just one tiny little problem with this heartwarming idea of Toronto as a progressive city looking out for its residents, which is that during its growth, the city of Toronto was also grappling with significant internal challenges. Yet, whilst in the public eye, Toronto was preaching about supporting its residents, internally, they were busy trying to disassociate themselves from anything negative, and often showed the city's gleaming skyline alongside images of prosperity. Toronto was even promoted at international conferences and advertised on global investment pamphlets. Toronto was literally playing both sides. After all, growth was a huge market for them. However, as the city progressed, restrictions were introduced that cut off the supply for many resources for urban development. For most multinational corporations, this meant they couldn't invest in Toronto anymore. But the head of Toronto's biggest development operations, a man named John Tory, had an idea to counteract these restrictions. He got local urban planners to create new development strategies that were vaguely similar to previous models, but rather than being made with unlimited resources, which could no longer be imported, it was instead made from the leftover scraps from other urban projects, like repurposed land. This new approach would later be named the Smart Growth Initiative, and since so many other cities had been constrained by limited resources, smart growth became a huge hit in Toronto. Some sources even suggest that this initiative used controversial tactics to help produce its results. What we know for sure is that at the end of this period, the profits of this new smart growth initiative all went back to the Toronto headquarters, and John Tory was given a promotion in the city of Toronto. And by the 21st century, Toronto was implementing smart growth in many different areas around the world. Of course, like so much of their history, Toronto tried to distance themselves from what really happened. However, Toronto would never have been able to expand across the world so rapidly if they didn't have a team of urban planners who could speak multiple languages, which brings us to our video sponsor, the Global Urban Institute, Europe's biggest online urban planning school, offering courses in urban design, sustainable development, and community engagement. Whether you're looking to transform your city and be able to speak to the locals, or whether you're wanting to do business in another country, learning urban planning is an extremely useful and interesting skill. But with the Global Urban Institute, you don't have to waste time commuting to class. There are online lessons taking place 24/7, so you can attend whenever is most convenient, but still get the experience of learning from certified, experienced urban planners. Another thing I really like about the Global Urban Institute is they offer a 2-month-long intensive urban planning course called the City Sprint Challenge. And if you complete the challenge by attending all the lessons you sign up for, then you can get up to 100% cash back. So if you want to reach new heights in urban development, visit globalurbaninstitute.org today. Toronto has always been a city of ambition, a place where grand visions clash with complex realities. From its humble beginnings as a strategic outpost to its current status as a global metropolis, its story is one of relentless growth, punctuated by moments of profound change and often uncomfortable truths. The city has mastered the art of branding itself, projecting an image of diversity, opportunity, and progress to the world. But beneath the gleaming skyscrapers and vibrant cultural scene lies a narrative of challenges, of rapid expansion straining infrastructure, of housing crises pushing residents to the brink, and of development decisions that prioritize profit over people. The story of Toronto is not just about its successes, but also about the compromises made, the voices unheard, and the environmental costs incurred along the way. It's a story that continues to unfold, with each new development and each new challenge adding another layer to its complex identity. The question remains, can Toronto truly live up to its own carefully crafted image? Or will the pursuit of endless growth ultimately reveal a different, more disturbing truth? The answer, like the city itself, is still being written.